Welcome to Real Rover. I'm your roving host, John Craig. Real Rover へようこそ、クレイグ・ジョンでございます。Introducing you to people you would never have heard of if it wasn't for Real Rover. Here we go.
Sure. Our guest today on Real Rover is Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. Is that correctly pronounced, sir?
That is correct, yeah.
Bernardo has a PhD in computer engineering from Eindhoven University of Technology and specializations in artificial intelligence and reconfigurable computing. He has worked as a scientist in some of the world's foremost research laboratories, including the European Organization for Nuclear Research, better known as CERN to many of us, and the Philips Research Laboratories. Bernardo has authored many academic papers and books on philosophy and science. His most recent book is The Idea of the World, a multidisciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality based on rigorous analytical arguments and empirical evidence. So the book has already reached number 1 and it's still pre-order. Is that correct?
That was a surprise to me. It has reached number 1 in a couple of categories in the UK and reached number 1 new release. So not number 1 overall, but number 1 new release also in a couple of categories in the US. But in the UK, the interest has been phenomenal, much more than I expected.
Oh, so there's hope for us Brits yet. Maybe we're on to something. You know, if there was a heavyweight title for the metaphysical championship of the world, I think you'd be a contender, not just because of the success of the book, but I have been following your work quite rigorously for the past 3 weeks, thanks to the exemplary interviews you've done with Jeffrey Mishlove, which are very detailed and go into almost all of the 6 books you've already written. And for some people, they may be difficult to grasp if they're not familiar with quantum mechanics or philosophy. And we're looking to bring your work out in Japan. Through this interview, Real Rover hopes to bring people like yourself to the attention of interested Japanese parties. And I know that you've been here. Tell us what Japan was like when you came.
I love Japan. I've been to Japan many times over the last 20 years or so, because in addition to doing philosophy and writing books and philosophy and science and so on, I earn my living doing corporate strategy, which sort of guarantees my philosophical independence, so to say. My opinions are uncensored because my employers don't care what I think about in terms of philosophy, about the nature of reality. So long as I help them succeed in business, it's all good. So in that capacity, as somebody working in the corporate world, I've been to Japan several times over the years, and I love the country, I love the culture, I love the food. I love being in Japan, even though I don't speak Japanese at all, so I feel a little bit like a fish out of water. Despite that, I feel very comfortable in Japan.
That's an important point, Bernardo, that you're independent. A lot of people may not know that the majority of scientists are actually directly or indirectly employed by the military-industrial complex. And so their research is inevitably poured into the way the paradigm wants their research to go. And you won't have your tenure very long if you start talking about the kind of world you're describing, which is that everything, absolutely everything we see, feel, touch, experience, the entire universe of experience is mental. So before we get into that, how did you become such a contender, a heavyweight contender in the metaphysical world? There must have been something happened, some event. I mean, what happened?
I think we are all born with certain dispositions, right? And I'm not going to deny that I have certain dispositions, probably from birth, but I really became cognizant of these dispositions after having worked on artificial intelligence for a while, both professionally and then as a hobby earlier in my life. You start thinking about the issue of mind because when you're doing artificial intelligence, you can replicate the patterns of information flow that we find in the brain. There are very good arguments to state that we are getting better and better at replicating those patterns of information flow. But at the end of the day, what you have is still microscopic switches that are either open or closed, either on and off. That's the binary language behind computers, even computers that are doing simulations of artificial intelligence. And then you ask yourself, but why would any of these be accompanied by experience? Why would all this information processing come together with a feeling of what it is like to be this information processing? Why these two things have to come hand in hand? Why would they come hand in hand? How could I create not only an artificially intelligent circuit, but an artificially conscious circuit? That was the question that started it for me. And at some point in my life, I realized things happen in your life, and at some point I realized that this very question is absurd. This very question of how can I create an artificially conscious being is based on a false premise, which is that consciousness can be created to begin with. I don't think consciousness can be created. I think all creation happens within the field of consciousness. Consciousness is what there is to begin with. Everything else happens within consciousness. So that realization got me started on these issues.
Are there other people that you've ever met in the field who've come to such a conclusion? I mean, that's very important. Consciousness can't be created. And yet the assumption is if we keep on working with artificial intelligence, one day the robot will start dreaming and planning. Other people you've met in the field? Anybody?
I think nearly everybody in the field who has philosophical thoughts as opposed to purely operational thoughts, which is what is dominating the field today. I mean, for you to make an application, a profitable application of artificial intelligence, you do not need to entertain any of these questions. I mean, Siri answers your questions on the phone without you having to wonder whether Siri is conscious or not, right? And Alexa answers to your questions without you having to worry about whether Alexa is conscious or not. But the people who do have philosophical thoughts, who entertain these deeper questions based on the work they do, I think they realize that clearly something is wrong. Whether what's wrong is that consciousness cannot be created, but it's already what there is, or whether what's wrong is that we are thinking in terms of monism and we should be dualists, or that there are properties of nature that we cannot reduce to material behavior. Whatever conclusion they extract from that, I think people who think philosophically about artificial intelligence realize that it cannot be as simple as simulating the information flow in brains and automatically getting something that's conscious in and of itself as an individual as well. The mistake of thinking behind this is that of believing a simulation to be the phenomenon that it simulates. As an example that I always like to use, it's a bit gross, but I will say it anyway. You can make a perfectly accurate simulation of kidney function on your computer, accurate down to molecular details, and that will not make your computer pee on your desk, right? Because a simulation is not the phenomenon that it simulates. It's a mock-up. So when we are doing artificial intelligence, what we are doing is a simulation of what happens in the brain, but a simulation is not the phenomenon. So an artificially intelligent circuit is not necessarily a conscious brain or a conscious nervous system like mine or yours. There is nothing it's like to be it. Its computations do not come accompanied by experience, by subjective first-person experience. And that's the faulty thinking that I think most of us who entertain these deeper questions conclude.
Yeah, it's very much the emperor has no clothes, because the predominant paradigm in the last 200 years, as we well know, has been scientific materialism. But what you have done, as I have gathered over the weeks, is that you have taken, in a sense, the weapons of the opponent, rigorous logic and understanding of complex systems like quantum mechanical systems. You've got a good background, as far as I can see, in neuroscience, figured out how the brain works, and yet many people will never have entertained the doubt that the brain does not generate consciousness, and that there is no empirical proof anywhere in the scientific world that the brain generates consciousness. So maybe you could take some of our newbies through why or how the brain cannot generate consciousness. By the way, your cat has been going back and forth. Maybe your cat's going to pee on the desk soon as a demonstration. I got a cat.
I have three of them.
So,
I have three of them. Hopefully they will not interfere.
I mean, nearly everybody, nearly all the scientific community rigorously believes that, 2 pounds of watery sugar and salt can generate Macbeth. It's an assumption. Is there any proof?
No, but let's start by acknowledging what is clear. There is clearly a correlation between brain function and our individual awareness. In other words, what it is like to be us as individual human beings. That correlation is obvious. We know that from measuring the neurocorrelates of experience. We know that brain activity tends to correlate with the experiences that subjects report. We know that if you interfere with the brain in certain ways, that your conscious inner life will be affected accordingly. I mean, the most trivial example is if you drink alcohol, your conscious state will change. There are more sophisticated examples. If you're undergoing brain surgery and the surgeon stimulates certain areas of your brain electrically, your conscious inner life changes completely. People are awake during brain surgery, by the way. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a way to do the same without having to open your skull. So there obviously is a correlation between brain function and inner experience. Now, does correlation imply causation? No, certainly not. Let me illustrate that by offering an alternative. Maybe what we call brain function is the image of our conscious inner life. It is the representation of our conscious state, the way our conscious states look like when observed from a second person or third person perspective. Now, the image of a phenomenon is not the cause of the phenomenon, but it obviously correlates with the phenomenon because it is what the phenomenon looks like from a certain point of view. Similarly, when one interferes with the brain, like a surgeon with a scalpel slicing through a brain or stimulating the brain electrically, that material process that I just described may itself be the image of what is in fact an interference between experiential states, which then present themselves to us in the form of the material world we see around us. So the thesis I'm putting forward does not contradict this obvious correlation between material processes on the one hand and conscious states on the other hand. What it basically says is that matter is the way certain conscious processes present themselves to us from a certain perspective, specifically from across a dissociative boundary, but I'm not going to get into those details. And that's not only the matter of the brain. The thesis is that all matter is the extrinsic appearance of conscious mental processes, even the matter of the inanimate world. The conscious processes underlying that matter, in other words, the conscious processes that matter is the image of, from our point of view, they are not personal conscious processes. They are transpersonal conscious processes, so I'm not endorsing solipsism. I think there is consciousness out there, and all matter is an image of what's happening in consciousness, not necessarily your personal consciousness, but in consciousness as an ontological category.
Yeah, this is an important distinction because solipsism is an easy one for people to go to. Oh, I create the universe. Therefore, I can control what goes on. But clearly, that is not the case. And I may dream certain things at night, but the world is still there in the morning, as you correctly described, because that's one of the main attacks that's going to come. You know, if our consciousness generates reality, well, then we can control the reality. But there are a lot of us around, and perhaps consciousness in your cat behind you too is a form of consciousness that is simply different. Your cat may be having a conscious experience we know nothing about, of course.
Yeah. This is a very common argument, that what you mentioned. I agree with you. It's also a peculiar one, this idea that if the world is in consciousness, then we should be able to control it. I mean, that's such a false assumption, and you don't need to be metaphysically sophisticated to realize it. Just think about your own conscious inner life. Forget about the world at large. Your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own visions, your own dreams. Can you control it all consciously? Of course not. Otherwise, there would be no neurotics. I mean, we can't control our dreams. We can't control our nightmares. Otherwise, we wouldn't have them. Or we can't control our emotions. Otherwise, we would never be distraught. We can't control even our next thoughts. Otherwise, there would be never intrusive thoughts. There would be no neurotics in the world. Nobody would need to go to a psychologist or talk to a psychiatrist, right? So it's an obvious fallacy, this idea that if it is conscious, then it should be controllable by our personal volition. Of course not. In the same way that you can't control your dreams, your visions, your hallucinations, or even your next trivial thought, you can't control what's happening in reality at large for the exact same reasons.
Yeah. I mean, are they our thoughts to begin with? I found the idea that before we make a decision, if we scan the brain to grab the right or the left of two test grabbers, 6 or 7 seconds before we are conscious of actually performing that action, something has already occurred in the brain, which suggests that we can't even know or control or imagine what we're going to say next. Like, I have no idea what I'm going to say next to you, and vice versa. But we assume that we're consciously able to do that. And it is, as you said, an enormous assumption. And anybody who's ever meditated, and this ridiculous idea of stopping thoughts, I don't know where this baloney came from, that you can stop your thoughts. But hey, I've been at it for 40 years. I never stopped a thought in my life. So, you know, I completely concur. But, you know, this idea is out there that, oh, consciousness means we can do more, or we can become more powerful. But you've really opened this can of worms, and you've said that materialism is just total baloney. And this must have caused you quite a lot of rebuttals, attacks. Have you experienced this?
Before I get into that, may I make a comment about the preamble of your question, which I think was very relevant, this idea that before we decide to do something, there is actually brain activity that is predictive of that decision, even before we are aware of what decision we made. I mean, the first one to point this out was Libé in 1985, I believe. He showed that the decision to press a button arbitrarily is preceded, I think, by half a second of mounting potentials in the brain that allowed scientists to predict whether the subject would actually press the button or not, even before the subject reported having made the decision. What is underlying this is a confusion that is so pervasive in philosophy, in neuroscience, and psychology, and has been pervasive for well over 100 years. Well over 200 years even. I think this confusion was already there in Kant and Schopenhauer at the end of the 18th century, which is a conflation between what is strictly speaking called consciousness on the one hand, or phenomenal consciousness according to Ned Block's definition, and on the other hand, meta consciousness. Now, the latter entails metacognition. You see, consciousness only requires that there be qualities of experience. A conscious state is a state in which there is something it is like to be in. If there is something it's like to be in a certain state, then that state is consciousness. It entails qualities of experience. That's all. Now, metaconsciousness requires more. In addition to there being an experience, there has to be an explicit awareness of the experience. In other words, not only do you have to feel something, you have to know that you feel that thing. You need to be able to report the experience to yourself. Hey, I am having that experience. I know that I am seeing this mouse. I'm not only seeing this mouse, I know that I am seeing this mouse. That is meta-consciousness. What Libet has shown, and what many of these experiments have shown, in which you can predict a decision based on readings of brain activity before the subject reports having made the decision, what you're showing there is that meta-consciousness comes later. That the awareness of the experience, which is what's needed for you to be able to report having made the decision, the awareness that you have made the decision comes later. The decision itself precedes it, but you're not aware that you have made the decision. That is conscious too, but it's not meta-conscious. So this delay is the delay between having an experience and becoming explicitly aware of the experience. As this is the terminology Jonathan Schooler proposed in 2002, that is meta-conscious transition. So this does not defeat the idea that everything is in consciousness. You just have to be aware that there is consciousness, phenomenal consciousness on the one hand, and meta-consciousness on the other, and not conflate the two. Now, having made this preamble, finally answer your question. Of course, I've been faced with a lot of opposition. People have tried to ridicule me, particularly the more prominent skeptics, Stephen Novella, Jerry Coyne. These guys, they are used to people promoting no-materialist views in a very soft way, in a way that's not very grounded in logic or empiricism. It's not internally consistent. It's not coherent. It's not argued with substance. So they think that if they hear somebody saying that materialism is not true, they can very easily, wipe the floor with this person. With me, I think they stepped on a mine, because I argue my case according to the exact same value system that they use, according to the exact same forms of argument that they consider superior, according to the exact same rules of the game that they think privilege materialism. In other words, logic, parsimony, and empirical grounding. These are the things I use to promote idealism and to ridicule materialism. These people are not used to that. They get a little confused at first.
Yeah, I think that's why you're up for the heavyweight title pretty soon. I mean, you've published in peer-reviewed journals like Scientific American. You've used the very tools of logic against those who think that those tools are sufficient. But you've also said in this tome, which I've recently gone through, Meaning in Absurdity, that logic itself is something that we have to take a closer look at. So maybe you could go into your views on how logic itself may not be the ultimate tool we need to understand consciousness.
Yes. I think logic is important because it's at I'm making a disclaimer first. And logic is important because it's at the foundation of human thought. When we discuss our culture's mainstream metaphysics or ontology, which today is materialism, but hopefully it will be something else in the future, that discussion is grounded, it's founded on our shared logical axioms, things that we human beings take to be true in a self-evident way. They do not need to be proven. Now, if A equals B and B equals C, then I know that A equals C. This does not need to be proven. It does not need to be proven that any statement is either true or false. It's not both and it's not neither. It's either true or false. This does not need to be proven, right? These are axiomatic statements that are characteristic of human thinking. And since we're discussing metaphysics, which is a human cultural phenomenon, we have to accept those as the foundation of our discussion. So the whole discussion about is it materialism, is it idealism, it is legitimately grounded on logic because it's a discussion about human culture. And human culture is founded on human logic, axiomatic as it may be. Now, but if we want to go beyond that for the sake of curiosity and exploration and personal insight, we have to remind ourselves that the axioms of logic are just that. They are axioms. They are arbitrary. We think they are self-evident because we are human beings, and human beings are put together in order to think just that. But the fact that we are wired to consider those statements as self-evident does not mean that they are actually true in nature at large, beyond the human mind. There are, in fact, very good reasons to believe that in nature at large, our logic is fairly arbitrary. In the world of philosophy of language and philosophy of logic today, there are many alternative logics that have been proposed. In other words, ways of thinking based on different sets of axioms. One of them, which I just mentioned to you, that a proposition is either true or false. It cannot be true and false, and it cannot be neither true or false. It has to be one or the other. That's called the law of excluded middle, which is one of the axioms of Aristotelian logic, which is our popular logic in the way we go about life. But there are very good reasons to think that this axiom should not hold, that it's an arbitrary axiom. So philosophers have proposed, mathematicians have proposed a different kind of logic called intuitionistic logic, in which it's not enough to prove that something cannot be false in order to show that it must be true. It's not enough to do that. To show that something is true, you need to show an example of it. It needs to be constructed in order to be true. It needs to be made. It needs to actually exist in order to be true. You cannot prove that it's true by simply proving that it cannot be false. That's not enough under intuitionistic logic. Now, this is something that's discussed in academic circles, in highly specialized circles. But if it would become a popular idea, it would change a lot of our, it would change our way of interacting with the world, with each other, our way of looking upon what's real and what's not real, because it's basically a sort of a constructivist logic. What is true is what has been created, instead of being a reflection of some Platonic world in which things are a priori true or false.
Well, of course, the argument immediately arises that that's a very Eurocentric Western philosophical view about logic, because our civilization, as you described it, what rules the world is indisputably, as far as anybody can see, Western ways of understanding and based on Western philosophy. But there was a lot happened before that, especially here in Japan, where the limits of logic have been known for thousands of years. And a good example is the Zen tradition, which clearly understands the limits of logic and actually the absurdity of everything, as you have mentioned in your book. But the way they do it is very pragmatic. They take the human being's logical system and they smash it to pieces with impossible questions, which are called koans, of course.
Koans.
And it's amazingly effective at showing an individual that logic can only go so far. But you've used it, I think, as far as you can possibly take it, given the Western context of the work. And you must have thought until now or experienced other cultures, maybe shamanistic cultures, Oriental cultures, that you felt an affinity to in this work?
Oh, certainly. I feel an enormous affinity towards Zen Buddhism, for instance. But you see, let's take this example, Zen Buddhism. What does a Zen teacher do? Does a Zen teacher explain to you how things actually are? He doesn't. He tries to bring you through that experience so you can know for yourself that this is how things are or are not. You have to have the direct experience, the direct insight. And the teacher is just there to point the way. He's pointing at the moon, and you should go to the moon instead of keep on looking at the finger, right?
Exactly.
I think this is the only ultimately transformative way. It is the only way in which you will be ultimately convinced, not only in your head, not only through a conceptual system, but in your heart, in a way that's felt and not only thought. So it's the only transformative way to attain insight. But it is not the way to change a culture.
That's important.
Yeah, because it would require such a large number of people attaining that insight more or less at the same time, in other words, within one generation, that it's probably not realistic. Most people live in illusion. The vast majority of people live in illusion. So what I'm trying to do is to take a complementary approach. I'm not a spiritual teacher at all, neither could I be, because I'm not enlightened. My notion of truth is still fairly conceptual, strong, but fairly conceptual. What I'm trying to do is to complement this idea of attaining personal insight directly, which one should do with the guidance of a teacher. I'm trying to complement that through changing the cultural narrative by means of a conceptual scheme that does not need to be experienced directly, but which can convince people at a conceptual level that it is pointing in the right direction, that it's pointing to the truth. And the reason I try to do that is that so much of our lives are ultimately guided by the mainstream metaphysical narrative, by the story by which we live. We live by stories, right? Man lives by stories. Human beings live by stories, by myths of one way or the other. Money is a myth. Institutions are myths. I mean, money has no inherent value. A company is not a person. It's not an individual. So we live by these myths. We live by the narrative of materialism, which tells us that if all that exists is matter and consciousness is just an ephemeral phenomenon of matter and eventually it will disappear, we will die and there will be nothing left of us behind, then the only conceivable meaning of life is to accumulate material goods. And therefore, let's wreck the planet because we are not going to be around to suffer the consequences because consciousness disappears after our brain disappears, right? So you see, that mythical narrative puts us on a path of self-destruction. And there aren't enough people who have had the direct first-person experience to change this. So what I'm trying to do is bite the conceptual bullet, acknowledge it for the limitations that it has, but use it to try to change the mainstream narrative, the story by which we live.
That's a very brilliantly put outline of your mission. And I concur. The amount of people talking about enlightened and the actual number of so-called enlightened people is phenomenally small, which says something about the difficulty of overcoming this profound illusion that seems so real. And so your approach is that the cultural narrative has to be changed. It's kind of paradoxical that now you've been given the tools to do this through technology, the internet, and science, which probably would not have evolved if we had not become so rigorously materialistic in the first place and trashed the planet. So it speaks volumes that the time is perhaps now, that your work is being so incredibly accepted at such a fast speed, because in any other century you would have been stoned to death or burned at the stake. I was thinking of Bruno there for a moment. But let's get back to, I wanted people to get a feel of where Bernardo's coming from. The actual theory of metaphysical idealism, I would suggest people read the books and listen to the many wonderful interviews you have with Jeffrey Mishlow. My interest in your work is exactly changing this cultural narrative. You're going to do it through writing, through, in a sense, going into battle with the logisticians of the materialist order. And what might happen if this really begins to become part of the cultural narrative, how could you imagine what might happen in 5 years, given the speed of the acceptance of these ideas?
5 years is not a long time. I've been at this for 10 years, and there has been changes. Certainly the acceptance of what I have to say has increased. I'm now taking a second PhD in philosophy based on this idea of idealism. So hey, one of the top universities in Europe is giving me a second PhD for an idealist thesis. I mean,
that's amazing.
That's something.
That's something.
Yeah. Papers published in mainstream academic journals. Scientific American is not really a journal. It's not really peer-reviewed, but it's a very popular science magazine. So that Scientific American has published so much of my material as well. It shows that, okay, that there is a change. But it's been 10 years that I've been at this. 5 years, I think little will change. I think the main changes will happen towards the end of my lifetime. I don't know. The seeds are being planted now, they're germinating, but you're not going to see a forest on short term. When the forest does come, one of the key things that I think may happen is, I have this theory that the intellect is the bouncer of the heart, that you will only be open to certain direct experiences if your intellect allows you to have those experiences. If there is something in you who grants at least the possibility, the vague plausibility that these experiences may reflect some level of truth. And that includes the direct experience of an illogical, absurd, but indivisible and unitary world based on consciousness. Even that direct experience of the unit and the primacy of consciousness, I think most people will only have if something in their minds, in their rational minds, grants some plausibility to it, grants that there is some possibility that it may be true. So I think the main thing that will change if idealism becomes a respected alternative in our mainstream cultural narrative for the nature of reality. In other words, this idea that consciousness is the primary thing in all of reality. One of the main things that may happen is that more people will have the direct experience of this because they will allow themselves intellectually to have that experience. What happens today is that people may have a momentary experience of oneness, but they dismiss it immediately afterwards. The seed doesn't have time to create roots. It's not abiding. It comes, is rationally processed, dismissed, and thrown away, and you go merrily on, and you even forget that you even had that momentary insight in a moment in which you were not guarded, when you were looking at the beach or looking at nature, and you have that insight, and very quickly you dismiss it and you don't even remember afterwards. I think if people accept intellectually that consciousness may be the basis of all reality, they will retain these experiences more. They will talk more about it with other people. They will realize that more people are having this experience too. And then a whole language will evolve around this experience of oneness. And that would be a major change, because right now we don't have a language for it. Where is the bush that has the berries that are good to eat? What's the direction of the place where the lions may come and jump on you? This very immediate, utilitarian, concrete things, that's what language evolved for. We've pushed the envelope of language with science recently. Talk about quantum fields and alternative logics and the abstractions of mathematics. We push the language there. Our language is highly metaphorical now. But we have not pushed it nearly far enough to capture the experience of oneness, of the a-logical core of reality. And that language may evolve if intellectually we accept the plausibility of this metaphysics. I think that will be the main change. And hopefully after that, maybe we treat the planet with a little more respect and each other as well.
Two key words, evolution and language. You had a discussion with Deepak Chopra whereby he asked you about your thoughts on evolution. We live in an age where the gene is supposed to be DNA, supposed to be a physical entity that somehow, as a physical entity, creates the magic of a myriad of forms out of a very, very simple set of codes. And so I think he asked you, well, is this the gene doing it, or basically is there a consciousness that uses the gene to do it? What are your views on that whole evolutionary outlook now?
Ultimately, as an idealist, I don't think there is consciousness on the one hand, and then genes or any other material substrate fundamentally independent of consciousness on the other hand, that consciousness can interact with or use as a tool. I think genes and everything material, these are images of conscious processes. They are what these conscious processes look like from a certain perspective. Genes, for me, is just what certain conscious processes at the root of life look like from a certain perspective, namely our dissociated perspective. It's the image of a process in the same way that your brain activity is the image of your feelings, of your thoughts, of your emotions, your hopes, your fantasies, and all that. All of those hopes, thoughts, emotions, feelings look like to me as your brain activity if I were to measure it right now. Genes, the same thing. Genes are the neurocorrelates of transpersonal conscious processes that are at the root of life. That's how I see them. Regarding evolution, I think there is plenty of evidence that what we call evolution by natural selection does happen. Not only in terms of the fossil record, but comparative genetics. I mean, there is an abundance of evidence that it does happen. What I do not think is the case is an idea that is embedded in evolution by natural selection as if it were intrinsic to it, which is this idea that evolution happens by chance, that it's all an accident. I don't think there is any evidence whatsoever for that. Because what would be the evidence that evolution happens randomly by accident? Well, evolution is not random in the sense that there are non-random factors that fix certain genetic mutations and discard others, but the mutations themselves, as neo-Darwinists would say, they happen randomly. And I think there is no evidence for that. The evidence would be that we would have a record, a sufficiently large record of all genetic mutations that ever happened, the ones that were fixed and the ones that were discarded, and then we would apply a randomness test to that, and then verify that there has been no trend in the raw genetic mutations themselves. Do we have that data? Of course not. That's not preserved by the fossil record. The fossil record is biased. It preserves only the mutations that have been fixed. It doesn't preserve the ones that have been discarded. Those are ephemeral. They come and disappear. So there is no, I don't think there is any evidence, and there is no logical reason either to believe that evolution has happened based on purely random mutations, that there has been no trend, that there has been no telos, no goal, no favored direction in the evolution by natural selection. For all we know, there has been a favored direction. For all we know, there is a telos in universal consciousness, an intrinsic disposition, or as Schopenhauer would put it, a will, a desire towards the evolution of higher life, of metaconscious life, because maybe that's the way for universal consciousness to become aware, explicitly aware of itself, to raise its head above its instinctual unfolding and look at itself and say, oh, that's what's going on. That's what I am desiring. That's why I am suffering. This is what I'm doing to myself, and this is why I'm doing to myself. Now I've become metacognitive of it. I've developed not only consciousness, but metaconsciousness, explicit awareness of what is going on. Maybe the desire to have this metacognitive insight is what drives evolution by natural selection. Is there proof for that? No. There are indications because of the variety of life. There are certainly some anecdotal indications. There's no proof for that, but there is certainly no proof for the idea that it all happens for no reason, by a pure game of chance and accident.
Well, there's no indication that our present so-called level of consciousness is in any way more advanced through our science than it was with the Greeks, with the ancient peoples of Sumeria, with even further of our civilizations, where they appeared to have For example, the Egyptians appeared to have a far deeper comprehension of how the physical world and consciousness work as one. So if there's such a thing as a linear evolution of consciousness, it's taken a really bizarre route to going forward through the last 200 years of scientific materialism.
This is rich territory, and territory I've never had the chance to discuss in an interview, so it's nice that you're bringing this up. If we take depth psychology as a metaphor, the psychology of the so-called unconscious, I think it's a misnomer. I think there is no unconscious. There is only areas of consciousness that are not introspectable into. We cannot introspect into them. In other words, they're not metacognitive. They're not metaconscious. They are experiences, but not experiences that we know that we have them. That's what I think is the unconscious. But let's forget this for the moment, and I would just use the word unconscious. Depth psychology has shown over the past 120 years or so that the unconscious is capable of amazing feats of cognition and insight. That the unconscious has a level of understanding that sometimes puts consciousness to shame, that we can intuitively apprehend much more than we can explicitly apprehend through the rational intellect, that the insights we have intuitively go far beyond the conceptual insights that we can achieve through intellectual manipulation of symbols. So from that perspective, if you take consciousness as a whole, unconscious and the egoic segments of consciousness, I think there has been little change or no change, because taken as a whole, consciousness is what it is. It's only manifesting its potentials, but what it is in potentiality is what it is. And if it's all there is, then it cannot change because it's all there is in potentiality. But I think what did evolve, what did change, is our ability to attain metacognitive insights. In other words, to not only have an intuitive insight, but to know that you have that insight and to be able to use it as an object for a meta-insight, an even higher insight. This explicit awareness of what we know. So not only knowing it, but knowing that we know it. I think that has changed. And I think there's a lot of evidence that this has been the case, that thousands of years ago, we thought mythically we knew a lot. And we had very little meta-consciousness. So that intuitive knowledge that we had was not perturbed by a dominating but tinier segment of consciousness. The metacognitive egoic consciousness couldn't dominate the instinctual unconscious. So life was governed by this broad, knowledgeable segment of consciousness called the so-called unconscious, the intuitive part of consciousness. And from that perspective, we were more in harmony with nature. We were much more rooted in nature. There was less egoic disturbance, less conceptual, metacognitive disturbance. We lived our lives according to our instinctual drives. And because those instinctual drives were the same that underlie nature as a whole, we lived in harmony with nature. That was before Adam and Eve bit on the fruit, the forbidden fruit of knowledge, and became aware that they were naked, although presumably they experienced their nakedness even before. They just didn't know that they were naked. And then at some point we bit of that forbidden fruit, and we developed meta-consciousness. We became aware, explicitly aware of our experiences. Not only did we experience, we knew that we were experiencing it. And now comes the rational, meta-conscious ego complex of consciousness, which has come to dominate the way we live our lives and has unplugged us partly from our instinctual, broader, wiser drives. So we've paid a price for it. We've disconnected ourselves from the rest of nature, from the planet. We are wrecking the planet now. It's a big price to pay. But we've achieved something. Something has evolved. We are meta-conscious beings. We are not purely driven by the archetypes of instinct anymore. Now we know that we know. We may not, that area of meta-consciousness may be small compared to the instinctual basis of it, but it is adding something to the evolution of consciousness in the universe. And the trick is, how do you profit from it? How do you preserve what you have gained without destroying yourself in the process? I mean, if we wreck the planet itself will repair itself. Give it 1,000,000 years and it's all back in order. There will be plants again, animals again. The question is, will we be there in 1,000,000 years? So how do we develop this addition, this teleological thing called meta-consciousness, the ability to introspect and become explicitly aware of what's driving us, of what's driving our emotions, what's driving our desires, what we know, what we don't know. How do we preserve this without destroying ourselves in the process because we unplugged ourselves too fast and too extremely from our instinctual foundations that ensure that we remain in harmony with nature?
You really nailed that one. That is probably the most important philosophical concern that we should be having. The price of metacognition is very high. On what value system do we base our saying that it's positive or not? I live in a culture where metacognition is not valued highly. It's not valued highly to express your own individual understanding or perspectives on reality because they will inevitably clash with those around you. So social harmony is a value here. And what that has done is it's actually kept the connection to the mythical past very richly alive, which comes at a price to the individual, which is that you got to toe the line with the majority. So here we come up against a really big philosophical wall in a sense of the Japanese will be listening to this and they'll be going, yeah, metacognition sounds really great. And to get there, we actually have to probably go through this incredible, destructive, horrendous process where the ego is understood, but then it's transcended somehow. It's a massive, massive conundrum. It's a paradox. And in a sense, it's really absurd, which brings me to this marvelous tone here. And so just for a couple of moments, I would like to share with people what kind of work you present and to kind of prepare themselves mentally to get a little bit serious about this. After all, we all seem to agree on what the world looks like. This is an important point. If everything is consciousness, how come we all see the same world in consciousness? So we seem to agree on what the world looks like. For there to be such commonality of description, I see the bookcase behind you and you see the wall behind me and you agree it's a wall and I agree it's a bookcase and that's a cat, yeah? And that's language does that. Language is what creates that bridge between us, a bridge of understanding or communication, creation maybe. Either we are all observing the same strongly objective world, which is what the realists say. There is a world out there and it looks the same because it's out there and we are on it and we're separate from it, which is absolutely the predominant view. Or B, which is what you're exploring, our minds are fundamentally connected to one another so we can all share the same dream. Now, this is a really tricky point here, that all of our minds can be sharing a reality. Is there an image you've used in your writing that would make that more accessible to people? How do we share it?
I think each person, each living being is a dissociated alter of universal consciousness. Now, what is this word, alter? We know that there is a condition in psychiatry called the dissociative identity disorder.
Multiple personalities, yeah.
In which the conscious self of a person breaks up into disjoint centers of consciousness, each with its own history, its own cognitive associations, its own sense of self, personality, identity, and so forth. And sometimes they We know that empirically as well. They fight with each other for control of the body. Dissociative identity disorder has only recently been proven objectively through brain imaging research. We know that it actually happens, that it's not people faking it. And there is dream research on people with dissociative identity disorder done in the 90s, which shows that when a patient of this dissociative disorder dreams, the different personalities, the different alters appear as different characters within the dream.
Mm.
And not only from the point of view of the host personality, but each of the characters has its own conscious point of view within the dream.
Mm.
And they experience each other from a second and third person perspective within the dream. That's research from the 90s. But yet they are all parts of the same mind, the mind of the person who has dissociative identity disorder. It's one psyche, it's one mind, which manifests the appearance of fragmentation. Yet they are all connected because different alters can share the same dream from different points of view. How can that happen? It happens because they're all part of the same mind at root level. They are connected. Even if at the level of appearance, because of dissociation, they seem to be disconnected and independent. Now, take that, which has been demonstrated through scientific research, and extrapolate that to the universe. I think there is only one universal mind, one universal consciousness that is not metacognitive. It didn't plan things out deliberately. It's just nature. Nature happens to be consciousness. It's just nature unfolding according to certain patterns and regularities that we call the laws of physics. And the emergence of life in nature is the advent of dissociative identity disorder at a universal level. You are one alter, I am another alter, my cats are other alters, and we are in the same mind. That's why we are sharing the same dream, and we experience each other from a second and third person perspective within the dream, because we are united at root. We are all dissociated mental processes, dissociated complexes of the universal mind. And all experiences are ultimately endogenous to universal mind. There's nothing outside the universal mind. And since we are all within it, we can share the dream because we are all parts of it.
Yeah, that's an analogy that came up in your book. And also, I think Deepak Chopra is fond of making a soundbite out of that, you know, we are all the universe looking at itself. But a long time ago in China, Huang Po wrote his brilliant treatise called The Zen Teaching of Huang Po is of One Mind. And that's all he talked about. There's only one mind. That's it.
Yeah.
There isn't anything else.
The trick is, and again, it's language and because of language and concepts, which are a consequence of meta-consciousness. So here we are paying the price for meta-consciousness again. The trick is, what do we mean by the word I or we, which is the same word in the plural? What do we mean by this self, by this identity? And there are two ways in which we use the word. And because we don't make this clear, this double usage clear, we miscommunicate. We talk past each other. If somebody says, like I do, it's only one mind, then somebody listening to me will say, come on, that's obviously absurd, because I can't access your thoughts, I can't access your feelings. Clearly I'm distinct from you, I'm another mind than you, so obviously you're not all one mind. Well, it's because we are using the word I in two different ways. One way to use the word I is as the recipient of experience, the dative of experience, pure, and I'm going to introduce a nice English word that most English speakers don't know, pure ipseity, I-ness, pure subjectivity, the recipient of experience, what Schopenhauer called the one eye of the world that looks out from every living being.
Wow.
Pure subjectivity without content, without narrative, without specific experiences that you identify with. Just that pure subjective point of view, which receives experience. That to which experience is disclosed. The qualities of experiences are disclosed to that recipient. That's the pure I. I would argue that that pure I is exactly the same in you as it is in me, as it is in the cat, as it is in the fish, as it is in the amoeba, as it is in the inanimate universe as a whole. That is the one mind, this contentless subjectivity, this contentless recipient of experience that's not differentiated. It's just pure subjectivity. That's the ultimate I, even for us as human beings, because you see, our opinions have changed since we were born, our memories have changed, our physical bodies have changed, everything about us has changed, everything, except this I, this pure subjectivity. That's the only reason why each one of us thinks that we are still the same person that we were when we were 5 years old. It's the only thing that has remained. Everything else has changed. Every atom, your conscious inner life has changed, your opinions, your views, your emotions, everything has changed except this pure contentless recipient of experience, which you know has remained the same, and it's the only reason why you think you're still the same person. The other I is given by content, by particular experiences. My subjective inner life is made up of a set of experiences that differ from the set of experiences that make up your inner life. I have different memories from you. When I look around, I see the world from a different perspective. I have different emotions than you, a different personal history, which is basically a set of memories interconnected together in a line. When we identify with these contents, now we become different. Now I'm different from you. If I attribute my identity to particular contents of consciousness, to particular sets of experiences, particular qualities, be them present, like how I feel right now, or past, like the memories I have, the moment we do that, we become distinct. And that's the other way we can use the pronoun I. From the perspective of this usage of I am different from you. But I am also different from my 5-year-old self. I'm certainly at least broader. My identity has changed from my 5-year-old self. So it's important to have clarity in this distinction. Otherwise, we just talk past each other. Yes, there is only one mind in the sense that there is only one contentless recipient of experience, one dative, one universal ipseity, what philosopher Ite Shani calls core subjectivity. But there are multiple I's if we identify ourselves with particular contents of consciousness. And both are true. Both are true. Actual aspects of reality. Yeah.
Language, I think, is the final thing I want to talk about, because you've mentioned a lot of very well-known philosophers from our Western tradition. There was a very great philosopher in this country that some people know abroad, outside of Japan. Almost nobody knows of his work within Japan. And I was fortunate enough to be given the entire set of his work, most of it in Japanese, but some of it in English. And he is Toshihiko Izutsu. And this is one of his masterpieces, which I strongly recommend to anybody doing the kind of work that you're doing, because he, I think, started as a linguist, but of all of the philosophers I've studied so far, this man has demanded more of my poor little brain than anybody else. He was a member of the Japan Academy and a professor emeritus at Keio University, and he actually taught in Tehran in Farsi. He taught at McGill University in Canada in English, and he lectured at the Eranas conference, which of course focuses a lot on Jung's work, and he wrote this book in English himself. So when I read it, the first thing I thought was, who translated this amazingly advanced understanding of language? And I found out that he wrote it directly in English. So I would strongly recommend another perspective here that is quite unknown through this man, Toshihiko Izutsu, and his understanding of how language is actually the magic that creates reality, which is a subject I'd be very much interested in talking more about, perhaps at a future interview. But I know that you do have your daily work. You're not a paid philosopher in the sense that it's a 9-to-5 job. How do you do it? I mean, so you're out there in the corporate world with people who probably have no idea that this altar is doing this amazing work. Do they ever cross these paths, the daily job and the philosophy?
I try to keep them separate.
Yeah.
But within me, of course, they cross. I mean, work for me is a bit of a break, a holiday. It doesn't require very, very deep thinking, although people there think that we think very deeply there. But it's, I mean, it is complex. There's a lot of content. It's very complex, but it's complex in the sense that a game of chess or Go is complex. It's a game. There are boundaries, there are rules, they are well understood, and you play the game within those boundaries. And from that sense, it's not really profound. You're not asking the primary questions of life and reality and identity in there. You're trying to win ground from your competitors. That's all. So it's a game. It's a relaxing game. Keeps me sane. I think I would take off and go to the moon if I didn't have work to ground me permanently here on the earth and the issues of the earth. The earth, I mean, including human civilization. And it also, I don't know whether it's true, but I believe it is true. It keeps me intellectually honest, because corporate world is a world in which if you deceive yourself, it will become very clear very soon that you've deceived yourself. You pay very quickly a price for wishful thinking, for lack of critique of yourself. So we are always questioning, do we really know this? Before we say something, do we really know it? Do I really believe it? What reason do I have to believe what I'm about to say? You're always critiquing yourself, questioning your assumptions all the time, because that's the only way you will survive and thrive in the corporate world. Otherwise, very quickly you pay a price for being a wishful thinker, or not being a careful thinker, not questioning your own assumptions, not questioning the basis you have for having whatever opinions or views you do have. And I think I import that pragmatism, that ability to be very critical of yourself into my work in philosophy. And from that perspective, my work in the corporate world has been very helpful. If you do want to talk about language, I do have time still, and it's a subject I enjoy very much. I don't know whether you want to do that in a second interview, but if you want to address it now, I'm game.
Well, I think what I would like to do is I would like to take what you've just said to heart, and I want to make sure that I really understand what this man is saying about, what he's talking about, before I open my mouth with my language. Okay. Because he's an incredibly demanding philosopher. He's very rigorous, just like you've described. He didn't have the corporate real world to balance him out. In those days, rich Japanese would sponsor a philosopher. That's exactly what happened. The man I worked with literally paid for this man's entire life. And he was with him at his death. That's the Orient for you. Because he realized this is a master of Sufi thought, Taoist thought, Zen, East-West, Jungian, you name it. He had studied it all because he had the time, because he didn't have a day job. So here you would treasure people like that and you would support them. In Da Vinci's time, of course, he would have somebody to pay the bills. But you're out in the real world. And I think what you've just described is very important, Bernardo, because here it's a very tough business environment. And like you said, if you do something that is really off kilter, you'll know about it very quickly. And
Oh, yeah.
your business career will be over because this is a very large village here in Japan. So thank you so much, Bernardo. I mean, that was an absolute delight. And I do hope it leads to more. I know you're going to get a whole bunch of people focusing on you when this book actually comes out. I'm waiting for it to arrive next month. I'm sure there will be much more interest in your work. I certainly hope so. And I wish you all the very best, and your cats.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. It was a
Thank you
pleasure talking
kindly.
to you.
I'll say goodbye.